Hey everyone, it's Carl, and there's a lot of great videos on world building. Advice at how to do it right. How much to do, what it should look like. But I want to talk about something that sometimes isn't talked a lot about, and that is culture. Adventure and intrigue, fighting monsters out of our league. We'll roll the dice and pray they're nice. A plus two. Hey everyone, it's Carl with Tabletop Tango. Look at the bubbles, do the stuff. We would really appreciate your support because I want to buy more Savage World stuff, let's be honest. So why is culture an interesting difference from other world building? Well, I think what's cool is if you define a culture that your players kind of buy into, it really makes it much more immersive. They feel like it's a different world. They feel like they're part of it, and it's not, the same old, it's not like living in the modern world in the super future, living in just my normal modern world, even though there's this urban fantasy piece, living in my modern world, even though there's been a significant change and it's now post-apocalypse, but somehow these same notions that we live with every day still exist. Yeah, in fantasy, you'll find that that medieval fantasy kind of tropes define that culture kind of naturally, and we just naturally think that that just is the way it is, right? You go into the tavern, there's somebody kind of a bard playing in the corner, and there's like happening music, and you're eating meat or drinking meat and eating mutton, and it's all like this is just the way it is, and that's culture. So let's talk more about how in a world building that might be something different, future, cyberpunk, urban fantasy, and even just want to do something different from a fantasy standpoint. So what are the things you think about? And I want to talk about in no specific order some of the ideas that I think are interesting. And I haven't done a great job myself all the time, but these are some of the things to think about. One of them is religion. That's an obvious, right? And most kind of role-playing games, if there's a religion, there's like good gods and bad gods. And if you're on the side of light, you believe in the good gods, and they're fighting some kind of epic battle with the evil gods in the heavens, beyond human grasp. If you think about even in our world, even 2,000 years ago, the gods that people believed in were significantly different than the gods today. So now extrapolate in your world, what are the gods and what are the, could be completely atheists, right? It's thousands of years in the future in a science fiction game, and nobody believes in God anymore. And that might play into as they meet less advanced civilizations, and not to say that if you're religious, it's less advanced, but folks who have yet to explain their natural environment in a scientific way, and they have a different take on what it means, with the sun god and that sort of thing. I had a game where the humans had been under the heel of vampires in kind of a medieval feel for thousands of years, and at some point there was another continent that nobody knew about. And at some point, some humans ventured too far in their fishing boats and ended up in that other continent. And then they grew and they progressed outside of this realm. And so at some point, they became much more like our modern day. But the point I'm trying to make is from a religious standpoint, their religion and how they thought about things was really informed by the fact that they used to be under the boot of these vampires and were just cattle. And now they've moved to this other land and they were kind of free. And their religion came all about this belief in that there's a great savior that took them out of bondage, and they should pay homage to them. And everybody on that continent really kind of felt the same, even if they called them different stuff. So that was informed by the experiences of the people. So religion's a big deal. Society and how society is put together. Now, society itself is not culture. Some people talk about society and culture are different things. Society is how people are organized themselves and how things are put together, and culture is kind of how they share beliefs and what they do. Okay, but I'm going to talk about society. So society and how these organizations or these pillars of society exist defines how people interact. And so like in the modern day, we have universities are kind of a institutional pillar of the modern day, right? It's the place where we drive learning and we drive new inventions and things like that. And so it's very important to our modern civilization that these things exist. And so our culture revolves around that in some ways. The fact that sports are a heavy thing in our society as well. Those institutions are important, and they drive the way people act and think. Um, so in literature, you can even think about like the Hunger Games, right? There's the games, and that defines how people think about the world they live in, and the differences between the different um, groups, the in groups and the out groups, and that sort of thing. So beyond society, then there's history. And from a world building standpoint, I'm not saying that you need to like define every step of history along the way, but I think it's important to at least think about what's the big things, defining moments that change the way people think or what their morality is or how they would interact with other societies that come in contact with them. Like, for the United States, the American Revolution fundamentally that piece of history really defines our culture. We're very big on rugged individualism, where tyranny is a word we throw about to just don't want to deal with that, because 200 plus years ago, this is the kinds of things we were dealing with, and it defined us very clearly. I mean, we even have a celebration called July 4th, just for the fact that that is a celebration, and it's been around for ever since the nation was formed. This vampire game I had, very similar thing, right? There was a day that they celebrated. It was the biggest day of the year, which was the founding day, when the first ships ended up in this new land. They celebrated it. It drives their commerce and how things are going on, and it really builds a really cool, at least in this case, it built a really cool opportunity for games and adventures that went around that whole week-long celebration. And it was all because players were now feeling part of that history and the things that the things that world had accomplished. Another one, which might not, it's more science, but I think of it as kind of the culture and how people think of that, is medical science. It has to be consistent. It has to be normalized, unless you are playing some dystopian where the rich are rich and the poor are poor. But generally, things are consistent within your world, and how people think about healing, think about injury is a big deal, right? So if there's a machine in this far future that you shove somebody in and it heals a wound, that's probably going to be used a lot. It's probably over time the price is going to be driven down, just like, cell phones were really expensive for us, and now they're relatively cheap, easy to obtain, unless you're buying the top of the line, but they're easy to get now and leverage. Same thing for that technology. As it goes, those things are going to be cheaper, easier, more accessible. So in the far future, this idea of having somebody with a broken leg or there's something unique about that. There's a reason for that, and that could drive interesting adventures as opposed to just being something someone brushes off and it's not a big deal because, oh well, right? So I don't know if I really cover that as well as I'd like to, but that's something to think about. Now you get to the classic culture things we talk about, like food. If you can come up with some interesting ways of differentiating the way people eat, the way people prepare food, how they, come together for those meals. Are they sitting together? Are they doing it alone? Are they putting meals, big feasts together in general? What does the food taste like? What's the flavor? All that kind of cool stuff will kind of help the players get immersed in a different culture if you're trying to make something different. And that's, like I said, that's why, this medieval fantasy westernized style, people go into the tavern and they're asking the game master, okay, what can I order off the menu? Because they want to be immersed in that feeling of being in that genre. So cool stuff, food. Another item is language. Very big in culture, right? The slang, you can invent languages, but I'm talking more along the lines of like slang and sayings. So how do people address each other? How do they say things that, like we do, right? We have sayings all the time. You don't know where they come from sometimes. in our own, where if somebody comes along and talks about throwing a shrimp on the Barbie, we immediately have a picture of Australia and how the people act and who they are and where they come from. Same thing for your game, right? And the play, and this is a cool part. This is a cool thing where the players, you can now source the table. Sourcing the table is always a fun thing if you can get the players involved and engaged. This is a classic, right? What are things? Hey guys, what are things called? I had a kind of a cyberpunk game where you had a whole industrial complex over here, outside of the main, big city, because nobody wants to deal with that. What do we call that? You call it industrial center? No, they said, well, call it the stacks. Or maybe I came up with that. Well, anyway, call it the stacks, and that's because there's all the smokestacks. And so when people were referring to, hey, we're hiding out in the stacks, that little bit of a language made kind of an interesting thing, an interesting play. I mean, the classic from a TV, right, is Firefly, where they got that old West vibe from the language and their mannerisms, but they've combined Chinese and English in a way where there's sayings in Chinese that everybody understands, and they're kind of combined sometimes with English, and so it just gives this feel that is really unique and interesting. And I think you can do that too by allowing players to help come up with what makes this place unique and different from a language, from the customary greetings and all that sort of thing. Really cool stuff, I think. Finally, when we talk about true culture, arts. How often do you really think about that when you're playing your role-playing games? What's art? What makes the soul of the denizens of this world, this far future, this combined urban fantasy, right? Now you're combining the trolls have come into existence with human. What kind of interesting art, and how does that drive gameplay? It's kind of cool. I again, in a kind of a cyberpunk game, we invented a kind of a genre of music and brought in a superstar who, is always almost like we have now the folks who've got the electronic systems and are bringing samples together. But this also included kind of a singing portion of it, and it was just unique for this world. And it played into one of the characters was really into this singer and this performer, and it really only, I think, got that way because it wasn't just, oh yeah, there's a singer and great, I'm a fan, but we built in our heads what this might feel like, and so that drove the fact that these concerts are going to have a very high energy feel, and versus if the culture was a different way, maybe they'd be much more subdued, and that would have led the adventure in a different path than it went down. So that's kind of neat, I think. So the arts are a big deal. How people talk, the foods they eat, really makes culture interesting. History drives how people think about things and what they look at. So cool stuff. Couple of extra, mentions, things to think about as well is education. How do people become educated? What do these institutions look like? Because they lots of times will drive how people think about the world around them, and and you see that, right? In a medieval game, you think about the peasants; they're uneducated, and so they don't understand the world. And here comes these adventurers who are worldly, who've they've gained their education through the school of hard knocks, and they can teach them, or they can learn from them, because in this world, the elders are the ones who teach the young folks, and there's really not these institutions of learning. So it's important to understand how education feels or builds up and makes it. So, I mean, obviously, if you're playing Traveler, you got a whole system built around how people learn to become what they are. Then there's some other stuff that kind of drives the way people think. When you do the racial design or the species, a lot of the things that go into how the species are put together will drive also that culture. So you can think about, the world of Star Trek, right? The Klingons, very tough, muscular, strong warrior, versus maybe someone who's some species that's much more frail, much more intellectual. They're going to interact with each other in a different way, so that's important too. So anyway, that's what I think about how culture could drive your world building in whatever game you do. My favorites happen to be Savage Worlds, but D&D could be it. If you're trying to do a fantasy that's different, a nice science fiction role playing game where you're trying to break maybe some of the tropes that you're too used to just using Star Trek or Star Wars as your and then urban fantasy, you can just blow it out of the water, right? Because now you're combining two different things, the races. The history could be they came together early, and that changed the way technology, techno magic, and that changes the way people think about stuff and how the educational systems put together. I mean, I've even just thinking about it, just if these early 1900s, if these rifts that you think of Shadowrun where it happened in the far future or in the future, if this happened in the 1900s before like the telegraph or the telephone or the early 1800s or the mid 1800s, before the telegraph and telephone, and wizards could easily communicate, you may have offices where the apprentices, they might be assigned to that. That might be something they have to do. They cast a spell to communicate, and that's part of them becoming, a wizard. That's part of their community service. What have you? And that could change the way people think about wizards. Maybe wizards are powerful and they're a big part of the world and how things work, but it's because they're the engineers of their world. And we know in our world, engineers are well respected, but they're not the captains of industry necessarily. Often that's people who are great at marketing and great at salesmanship, and so what is that? All sorts of cool stuff you can come up with, but it's all based on the culture and how people perceive the world around them. Anyway, I think it's pretty cool. So I'm Carl with Tabletop Tango. Again, look at the bubbles, do the stuff. Appreciate you watching. I hope you don't mind rambling a little bit, but I think it's pretty cool stuff. Thanks. Adventure and intrigue. Fighting monsters out of our league. We'll roll the dice and brave the nice. A +2 and I might succeed. Whether Cthulhu or D&D.